The laboratory smelled like burnt copper and fear. Dr. Haven adjusted his six compound eyes, trying to make sense of the readings scrolling across his screen. In 300 years of genetic analysis, he had never seen the scanner malfunction like this. Species after species had passed through his lab, their DNA decoded and cataloged with perfect precision. But these humans were different. The sample sat in the crystalline chamber, a simple blood drop provided by the human delegation waiting outside. Standard procedure for any species applying to join the Galactic Council. Map their genetics, understand their nature, predict their behavior. Haven had done this 12,000 times. It should have been routine. The scanner hummed, processing terabytes of genetic information. Aggression markers came back normal, slightly elevated but nothing alarming. Territorial instincts showed within acceptable ranges. Social cooperation scored high, which was good for a potential member species. Then the scanner reached the section coding for mercy, compassion, and empathy. Every alarm in the lab triggered at once that Haven's assistant, a young researcher named Pip, jumped from her station. Doctor, the containment field is spiking. Should I abort the scan? No, keep it running. Haven studied the cascading data with growing unease. The numbers made no sense. Mercy genes were typically small, isolated sequences tucked away in the brain chemistry codes. Most species had them as evolutionary remnants, little fragments that help parents care for offspring or enable basic pack bonding. Simple, predictable, contained. Human mercy genes were everywhere. The scanner traced them through the entire genetic structure like veins of gold through rock. They connected to memory formation. They linked to threat assessment systems. They interwoven with the fight-or-flight response, with pattern recognition, with long-term planning centers. The mercy coding wasn't a separate system. It was integrated into everything that made humans survive. Pip leaned over his shoulder, her scales rippling with confusion. That can't be right. The scanner must be broken. How can a survival species have mercy genetics in their combat response systems? Haven ran the scan again, then a third time. The results remained identical. He pulled up comparison data from the Council archives, overlaying human genetics against every known species. The difference was staggering. Where other species showed mercy as a learned behavior or a social construct, humans had it hardwired into their most basic instincts. Call the Council, Haven said quietly. They need to see this. Within an hour, the Council's senior members gathered in the observation room above the lab. Haven displayed his findings on the central projection, highlighting the areas that disturbed him most. The counselors watched in silence, their varied forms casting strange shadows in the dim light. Council Speaker Morith, whose species had survived predators for millions of years through cautious wisdom, spoke first. Explain what we're seeing, Doctor. In simple terms. Haven chose his words carefully. Every species we've studied shows mercy as either a weakness or a social tool. It emerges after safety is established. It's something that happens when survival is no longer the primary concern. But humans evolve differently. Their mercy isn't separate from their danger. It's part of it. That makes no sense, growled Council General Cran from his corner. The massive bear-like creature shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. Mercy is the opposite of survival instinct. You spare the weak, you feed those who can't contribute, you waste resources on those who would die anyway. That's how prey species think, not survivors. That's what I thought too, Haven admitted. He pulled up a genetic map, highlighting specific sequences. But look at this connection here. When a human perceives suffering in another being, their threat assessment system activates. Not their compassion center alone. Their actual danger evaluation protocols engage. They process another's pain as if it were a threat to themselves. Pip added her findings to the display. We cross-referenced with their historical databases. Throughout human evolution, the individuals with the strongest mercy responses were the ones who built the largest cooperative groups. They didn't just help their own family. They helped strangers, even former enemies, if those individuals were suffering. And those large cooperative groups outcompete smaller, more aggressive tribes every single time. Morith's crest flattened against his skull, a sign of deep concern. Are you suggesting that human mercy is a weapon? Not a weapon, haven't corrected. A strategy, and a frighteningly effective one. They don't show mercy despite being dangerous. The mercy makes them dangerous. It creates unpredictable alliances. It generates loyalty across genetic lines. It means that if you harm one human's friend, you might gain 100 human enemies, even if those enemies never met the victim. The council chamber fell silent. The implications rippled through each member's thoughts. They had dealt with aggressive species before, warlike cultures that respected only strength. Those were manageable, predictable. You showed greater strength, they backed down. Simple. But a species that cooperated across tribal boundaries because of genetic compassion, that saw suffering as a threat requiring action, that couldn't be predicted or controlled through traditional means, General Kren broke the silence. What's your recommendation, Doctor? Having looked at the genetic display, at the human sample still sitting in its chamber, at the readings that had terrified him more than any predator species he'd analyzed, he thought about the human delegation waiting patiently outside, unaware that their DNA had just revealed them to be one of the most dangerous species the galaxy had ever encountered. I recommend we study them further before making any decisions, because this species doesn't show mercy despite being dangerous. He paused, meeting each council member's gaze. They're dangerous because they show mercy, and I don't think any of us understand what that truly means yet. The council members exchanged worried glances. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, they were terrified not of a species' capacity for violence, but of their capacity for compassion. Professor Inara had spent 40 years studying civilizations, but nothing prepared her for the human archive dive. The Council had granted her team unlimited access to humanity's historical database, expecting to find explanations for the genetic anomaly Dr. Haven discovered. What they found instead made the genetic readings seem tame by comparison. The research room buzzed with activity as Inara's team processed terabytes of human history. Her webbed fingers danced across the interface, pulling up file after file. Wars, disasters, conflicts, treaties. Every civilization had these. But the pattern emerging from human history was unlike anything in the galactic records. Professor, you need to see this, called out Bryn, her junior researcher. The young mammalian scholar looked shaken. I found something in their ancient records. A war between two human nations, bitter enemies for generations. During one battle, soldiers from both sides stopped fighting to rescue a group of children trapped between the battle lines. They worked together, saved the children, then went back to killing each other the next day. Inara felt her throat sack inflate with stress. That's irrational. They risked their lives for enemy offspring. It gets stranger. Bryn pulled up more files. There are thousands of similar incidents. Soldiers sharing food with starving enemies. Doctors treating wounded prisoners before their own forces. Pilots risking their lives to save enemy pilots they just shot down. They have a saying, "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." But they also have another one. Even enemies deserve mercy. Inara moved to the central display, pulling up a timeline of human civilization. Red markers indicated conflicts. Blue markers showed acts of cross-tribal cooperation. The screen looked like a tangled web of contradictions. Humans fought constantly, yet they also cooperated constantly, often with the same groups they were fighting. Another researcher, Cal, added his findings. I've been analyzing their legal systems. Every major human civilization developed concepts of prisoner rights, rules of war, and protections for the defeated. Not because it was practical, but because they deemed cruelty unacceptable even against enemies. They literally limited their own effectiveness in combat to reduce suffering. That should have made them weak, Inara muttered. Any species that handicaps itself in conflict should have been conquered by those who don't. That's what I thought too, Kel said. But look at what happened when one group violated those mercy rules. Other humans, even neutral parties, would turn against them. The cruelest forces didn't win. They got isolated and destroyed by coalitions that formed specifically to stop them. Human mercy isn't individual. It's collective. Attack one human's sense of justice, and you might face millions who've never met the victim. Inara spent the next several days immersed in human history. She watched recorded footage of disasters where humans ran into burning buildings to save strangers. She read accounts of humans who hid and protected people their own governments deemed enemies. She studied their literature, filled with stories celebrating heroes who showed mercy at great personal cost. The pattern became clear and terrifying. Human mercy wasn't naive kindness. It was a sophisticated survival mechanism that created bonds across every imaginable boundary. Humans who showed mercy gained allies. Humans who received mercy often became loyal beyond reason. The genetic trait Dr. Haven found wasn't a flaw. It was the foundation of humanity's greatest strength, their ability to cooperate with anyone, even former enemies. If mercy created the bond, point one file particularly disturbed Inara. A human nation had been attacked, thousands killed. The world expected vengeance. Instead, the attacked nation sent aid to their attackers' civilians who were suffering under a different crisis. When asked why they would help those who harbored their enemies, a human leader said something that made Inara's blood run cold. Because we refuse to become what we're fighting against. She presented her findings to the council that evening. The chamber was packed, every member wanting to understand the threat humanity posed. Inara projected images, data, and historical records across the curved walls. Humanity's mercy is not a weakness we can exploit, she began. It's a weapon we don't understand. Throughout their history, the most successful human groups were not the most aggressive or the most peaceful. They were the ones who could be both. Fierce to enemies who crossed certain lines, merciful to those who didn't. And crucially, no one ever knew where those lines were until they'd crossed them. She pulled up a graph showing human coalition formations. When humans perceive cruelty, even against those they dislike, they unify, not through government orders or tribal loyalty, but through individual choice driven by genetic disgust at suffering. They call it standing up for what's right. We would call it a coordinated threat response to abstract ethical violations. Council Speaker Morith leaned forward. What you're describing sounds like a species-wide hive mind triggered by empathy. Worse, Inara said, a hive mind can be disrupted by destroying the central connection. Human mercy has no center. It's distributed across their entire population. Each human makes independent choices to act against cruelty, but those choices align so consistently that it appears coordinated. You can't negotiate with it, can't bribe it, can't threaten it into stopping. It's hardwired. General Kryn growled from his position. So we're dealing with a species that will unite against us if they decide we're cruel, regardless of our actual threat level. Yes, Inara confirmed. And here's what terrifies me most. I analyzed their greatest military leaders, their most effective warriors, their most celebrated heroes. Do you know what they all had in common? A strong capacity for mercy. The humans who could forgive and protect were the ones who built the largest armies, commanded the most loyalty, and won the longest-lasting victories. Mercy made them stronger, not weaker. She closed her presentation with a final image. A human child sharing food with a wounded animal that had tried to bite them moments before. We think of mercy as something that emerges after safety. For humans, mercy is what creates safety. They don't survive despite their compassion. They survive because of it. The council chamber remained silent as the implications settled over them. They weren't just admitting a new species. They were potentially unleashing a force that would judge the entire galaxy by standards of compassion no one else shared, and had the unity and determination to enforce those standards whether invited to or not. The observation deck overlooked the detention center's main floor, where a simple wooden chair sat under harsh white lights. Ambassador Ruth Davies stood with her hands clasped behind her back, watching as council guards escorted the prisoner into the room. The reptilian creature called Sark shuffled forward in restraints, his scales dull from weeks in holding. Ruth knew this was a test. Dr. Haven had warned her privately, breaking protocol because he felt humans deserved honesty. The council wanted to see if the genetic findings matched reality. Would humans really interfere in another species' justice system because of mercy? The human delegation stood behind Ruth, 6 diplomats who'd been carefully briefed on council law. They were observers only, guests on this station, with no authority to intervene in legal proceedings. The message was clear: watch, learn, stay silent. Sark had been convicted of theft, smuggling medical supplies meant for a plague-stricken colony, and selling them on the black market. Dozens had died waiting for treatment that never came. Under council law, his punishment was public humiliation followed by pain compliance therapy. 60 seconds of neural stimulation that would feel like hours of burning. Non-lethal, technically humane by council standards, and highly effective at preventing repeat offenses. The lead arbiter, a crystalline being named Quill, read the charges in a voice like wind chimes. Sark said nothing, just stared at the floor. He'd already confessed. The trial was over. This was merely the consequences. Ruth felt her heart rate increase as the guards fitted the neural crown onto Sark's head. She'd read about this device. It didn't damage tissue or leave marks. The prisoner would recover fully within an hour. By council standards, this was mercy compared to the death penalty or permanent exile. She watched the countdown begin on the display. 60 seconds. Sark's body went rigid as the stimulation began. His mouth opened in a soundless scream. The neural crown prevented vocalization. Another mercy to spare the prisoner embarrassment. 15 seconds passed. Ruth's hands clenched so tight her nails cut into her palms. Around her, the other human diplomats shifted uncomfortably. She heard quiet breathing, someone counting down under their breath. 30 seconds. Sark's scales had gone completely white. Stress hormones, the briefing documents had explained. Harmless, but dramatic. Ruth thought about the people who died because of this creature's greed. Children, elderly, vulnerable beings who suffered while he profited. He deserved punishment. She believed that. But watching it happen felt wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. 45 seconds. Something broke inside Ruth's chest. Not her resolve, but her ability to stay still. She'd been raised to respect other cultures, to understand different justice systems, to not impose human values on alien societies. But her body didn't care about cultural sensitivity. Her legs moved before her brain approved. Stop. Ruth walked down the stairs from the observation deck, her voice cutting through the chamber. Stop the punishment. Please. The countdown froze at 52 seconds. Quill rotated to face her, fractal patterns swirling across their crystalline surface. Ambassador Davies, you are interrupting a legal proceeding. Return to the observation area. Ruth kept walking until she stood next to Sark's chair. Up close, she could see the creature trembling, his reptilian eyes unfocused. I understand this is your law. I respect that. But I'm formally requesting clemency consideration. On what grounds? Quill's harmonics suggested confusion. The prisoner confessed. The evidence is irrefutable. The sentence is within council guidelines. On grounds of mercy. Ruth looked at Sark, then at Quill. He's suffered enough. The remaining 8 seconds won't add justice. They'll only add pain. General Kryn's voice boomed from the observation deck. The human understands our laws. She was briefed extensively. This is not her jurisdiction. Ruth nodded. You're right. I have no authority here. But I'm making a personal appeal. If those last 8 seconds must happen, let me take them. Transfer the neural crown to me. I'll serve the remainder of his sentence. The chamber erupted in shocked murmurs. The human delegation started forward, but Ruth raised a hand to stop them. Quill's patterns flickered rapidly, the equivalent of stunned silence. You would suffer for a criminal? Quill asked. A being who let children die for profit? A member of another species who means nothing to you personally? Yes, Ruth said simply. She started to say more, to explain, but realized she couldn't make them understand with words. How could she explain that watching suffering when she had power to stop it felt like dying? That letting cruelty continue through inaction made her complicit? That her genetic code screamed at her to intervene the same way it would scream at her to pull someone from a fire? Sark looked up at her with slitted eyes. Why, he croaked. I am guilty. I deserve this. Ruth met his gaze. Maybe you do, but I don't deserve to be the kind of person who watches someone suffer when I can stop it. Even if stopping it costs me. Even if you're guilty. Even if you'd never do the same for me. Because if I can stop suffering when it's in my power to do so, and I don't, then I'm not the person I want to be. Quill turned to Morith in the observation deck. The council speaker descended slowly, his crest flat against his skull. He studied Ruth for a long moment. You're serious, Morith said. You would endure neural pain to reduce this criminal's sentence by 8 seconds. I would, Ruth confirmed. Though I'd prefer you just stop the punishment entirely. He's clearly learned his lesson. Morith looked at Sark, then at Ruth, then at the other human diplomats who'd all descended the stairs to stand behind their ambassador. Not to argue, Ruth noted, just to be there. To support her choice even if they didn't fully agree. Remove the neural crown, Morith ordered. The sentence is complete. But there are 8 seconds remaining, Quill protested. The sentence is complete, Morith repeated, his voice hard. Because if we continue, this human will find a way to interfere, and I'm not ready to discover what happens when humans decide our justice system is cruel. As the guards removed Sark's restraints and led him away, Ruth felt her legs shake. Adrenaline crash. She'd just gambled humanity's council application on 8 seconds of mercy for a guilty criminal. Morith approached her. You realize you may have just failed this test, Ambassador Davies. We were evaluating whether humans could respect our systems. Ruth straightened. Then I failed. But I'll fail that test every time if passing means watching preventable suffering. Morith's crest lifted slightly, almost like a human might raise an eyebrow. That's precisely what terrifies us, he said quietly, and walked away. Ruth stood alone in the chamber, wondering if she'd just saved humanity's application or destroyed it. Either way, she knew she'd make the same choice again. That was the problem with mercy. Once you knew you could stop suffering, not acting became its own form of pain. General Kren had survived 3 wars, 2 assassination attempts, and a planetary evacuation. None of those experiences prepared him for the report he was about to deliver. The classified assessment sat on the conference table like an armed explosive, its red security seal reflecting the dim lights of the council's war room. The senior military advisors gathered around the table represented the galaxy's finest tactical minds. Each had commanded fleets, defended worlds, and studied warfare across 1,000 different species. They'd evaluated threats from aggressive expansion empires, hive mind collectives, and resource-desperate civilizations. Standard procedure when a new species applied for membership: assess their military capacity, identify potential threats, recommend security protocols. Humans should have been straightforward. Their technology was average. Their fleet size was modest. Their weapons were conventional. On paper, they posed minimal military threat. Kren had written dozens of these assessments. Usually took him a week to compile the data and draft recommendations. He'd spent 3 months on the human evaluation, and he still wasn't sure he'd captured the real danger. Begin your presentation, General, Morith said from the head of the table. The council speaker looked tired, his crest drooping. The incident with Ambassador Ruth Davies had shaken him more than he'd admitted publicly. Kren stood, activating the central display. Human historical battles appeared in sequence, color-coded by outcome. I need to start with an unusual observation. When analyzing human military history, conventional metrics don't work. Win-loss ratios, technological advantages, numerical superiority. These factors matter, but they don't predict outcomes reliably. Admiral Fenn, a veteran naval commander, leaned forward. Explain. Humans have won battles they should have lost, and lost battles they should have won with disturbing frequency, Kren continued. The variable isn't their tactics or weapons. It's whether they believe their cause is just. When humans fight for what they perceive as mercy or justice, they become exponentially more effective. When they fight for purely strategic reasons, they're average at best. He pulled up a specific battle. This engagement, humans were outnumbered 4-1, technologically inferior and strategically isolated. They were defending a colony of refugees from another species. They held the line for 16 days until reinforcements arrived. Casualty rates suggest they should have broken within hours. Desperation explains that. Finn countered. Cornered prey fights harder. That's what I thought, Kren agreed. But look at this. He showed another battle. Same humans, similar odds, fighting for territorial expansion. They retreated within 6 hours and negotiated peace. The variable wasn't the stakes. It was whether they viewed the fight as protecting the vulnerable versus claiming resources. The room fell quiet. Kren moved to his central thesis, the part that had cost him sleep for weeks. Humans don't just fight harder when defending mercy principles. They fight smarter. Their cooperation increases, their innovation accelerates, and most critically, they recruit allies they shouldn't be able to recruit. He displayed a web of human alliances throughout history. Humans have a pattern of turning enemies into allies if they can establish moral common ground. Former adversaries become their most loyal partners, not through conquest or subjugation, but through demonstrated mercy, followed by mutual cause. They did this repeatedly on their own planet. They're already doing it in preliminary diplomatic contacts with Council species. Defense Minister Tala, whose species had pioneered psychological warfare, interrupted. You're describing ideology, not military threat. Many species fight harder for beliefs. No, Kren said firmly. Ideology can be countered with competing ideology. Human mercy isn't ideological. It's genetic. You can't reason them out of it, can't offer them something better, can't wait for the belief to fade. Dr. Haven's findings confirm this. When humans perceive cruelty, their neural chemistry changes. They enter a state that combines threat response with social bonding, making them both individually dangerous and collectively coordinated. He pulled up a simulation he'd run dozens of times. A model to conflict scenario. Standard war game. Humans versus a conventionally superior force. When I programmed human behavior based on standard species parameters, they lost predictably. When I added their mercy response patterns, their tendency to unify against perceived cruelty, their ability to recruit allies through protective behavior, their increased combat effectiveness when defending others, the simulation couldn't predict an outcome. Too many variables shift simultaneously. The simulation played across the display, showing branching probability trees that grew increasingly chaotic. The problem isn't that humans are invincible. They're not. The problem is that they're unpredictable. You can't determine what will trigger their mercy response until it's too late. And once triggered, you can't calculate how many of them will respond or who they'll bring with them. Morit's crest lifted slightly. General, your report was supposed to assess whether humans are a military threat. What's your conclusion? Kren took a breath. Humans are not a military threat in conventional terms. They won't invade neighbors for resources, won't expand aggressively, won't seek dominance through force. But they're the most dangerous species we've encountered because we cannot predict what they'll consider worth fighting for. He advanced to his final slide, a simple text summary that had taken him weeks to word correctly. Humans have demonstrated a willingness to sacrifice resources, territory, and lives to stop cruelty against beings they've never met, of species they have no alliance with, in conflicts that don't affect their interests. They have united their entire planet multiple times in history, not because they were attacked, but because they witnessed injustice. That sounds like they'd be ideal council members, Talus said. Defenders of the weak, champions of justice. It would be, Kren said, if we could control the definition of cruelty. But we can't. Humans define it themselves, and their threshold is lower than any species I've studied. Practices we consider normal, hierarchy enforcement, resource allocation, criminal punishment, humans might classify as cruelty. And if they do, if they decide the council itself is cruel, we won't face a military invasion. We'll face something worse. What could be worse than invasion? Finn asked. Kren met his gaze. Moral resistance. Humans refusing to cooperate with council authority. Humans sheltering those we punish. Humans recruiting other species to their interpretation of justice. We've seen it in their history. They didn't defeat their own oppressive systems through military might. They defeated them by convincing enough individuals that cooperation with cruelty was unacceptable. They turned the system's own members against it. The implications hung in the air. The Council wasn't just evaluating whether to admit a new military force. They were evaluating whether to admit a species that might judge the entire galactic order and find it wanting, then possess both the conviction and the capability to change it. Recommendation? Morith asked quietly. Kryn thought about Ambassador Ruth Davies standing in that chamber, offering to suffer for a criminal she'd never met. He thought about the genetic data showing mercy wired into human survival instincts. He thought about his simulations that couldn't predict human behavior because compassion wasn't logical. My recommendation is that we admit them, Kryn said finally. Not because they're safe. They're not. But because keeping them out is more dangerous. If we reject humanity, they'll still act on their mercy instincts wherever they encounter cruelty in the galaxy. But they'll do it as outsiders with no stake in preserving Council authority. At least as members, we might have some influence. He deactivated the display. We let them in because we're terrified of what they'd do if we kept them out. The freight scanner indicated standard cargo, mining equipment, food supplies, and replacement parts. Tim Bradley watched the display from his station in the Council Patrol ship security bay, bored by another routine inspection. 3 months into the human integration program, and most of his shifts involved watching legitimate traders pass through checkpoints. The galaxy was surprisingly peaceful when you weren't looking for trouble. The Dreth freighter sat in the docking clamp, a battered vessel that had seen better decades. Its captain, a reptilian creature named Voss, had submitted all proper documentation: trading license, cargo manifest, destination permits. Everything looked correct on paper. Tim's supervisor, a methodical insectoid named Officer Jix, processed the paperwork with practiced efficiency. Standard inspection, Bradley. Visual confirmation of cargo. Then they're clear to proceed. Something felt wrong. Tim couldn't explain it, just a tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with the station's recycled air. He'd felt it before on patrol back on Earth, that subtle warning that made good security officers check one more time. The cargo bay temperature is elevated, Tim noted, watching the environmental readings. Mining equipment doesn't need heating. Jix waved an antenna dismissively. Old ships have temperature regulation issues. We're not engineers. If the cargo matches the manifest, we approve transit. Tim followed Jix into the freighter's cargo hold. Rows of equipment crates filled the space, properly secured and labeled. Everything matched the manifest exactly. Too exactly, Tim thought, like someone had been very careful to make everything perfect. Then he heard it, a soft sound, barely audible over the ship's systems. A whimper. Did you hear that? Tim asked. That Jix's antennae twitched. Hear what? These old ships make noise. Complete your visual confirmation. Tim moved toward the rear of the cargo bay, following the sound. Behind a stack of legitimate cargo crates, hidden from the entry point, he found them. Smaller containers, unmarked, with ventilation holes drilled in crude patterns. Through the holes, he saw eyes. Dozens of eyes, belonging to beings from species he recognized from Council databases. Scared eyes. Captive eyes. His hands shook as he activated his comm. Jix, we have a situation. The inspection revealed 23 beings crammed in those hidden containers. Malcari miners who disappeared from colony. Pesh traders reported missing months ago. Even 2 Tolan children who'd vanished from station. All alive, barely. All being transported as cargo. Captain Voss and his crew were detained immediately. They didn't resist, didn't show remorse. Just looked annoyed at being caught. When questioned, Voss shrugged his scaled shoulders. They're unregistered workers. We were transporting them to mining operations. Perfectly legal in some sectors. It's slavery, Tim said flatly. Jix reviewed Council law on his datapad. Technically, he's correct. In systems without specific sentient being protection statutes, this falls into a legal gray area. We can charge them with improper cargo documentation and safety violations. Maximum penalty is fines and probation. Tim felt something crack inside his chest. Not his ribs, his ability to stay calm. You're telling me they kidnapped 23 people, kept them in boxes, were selling them as labor, and the punishment is a fine. Council law is complex, Jix explained patiently. Different species have different concepts of autonomy and labor. We can't impose universal standards. The captives will be returned to their home worlds. The traders will pay penalties. The system works. The system is broken, Tim said. He looked at Voss, who was already calculating how quickly he'd be released. Weeks, maybe months. Then back to the same business, just more carefully. Tim made a decision that would either end his career or change everything. He accessed the patrol ship communication array and sent an encrypted message to the nearest human diplomatic vessel, attaching every file, every image, every piece of evidence they collected. Subject line, "They're laughing at us." Within 6 hours, the human ship Determination arrived at the patrol station. Its captain, a woman named Diana West, requested immediate docking permission. Not asked, requested with the kind of politeness that made clear refusal wasn't really an option. Tim met her in the station's conference room. Jix was there too, confused about why humans were involved in a closed council matter. Captain West reviewed the evidence on her datapad, her face growing harder with each file. 23 beings, she said quietly, including children. Council law is handling it, Jix assured her. The criminals will face appropriate penalties. Appropriate, West repeated. The word came out flat, dangerous. Officer Bradley, what happens to Voss and his crew after processing? Tim checked the database. They'll likely be released in 3 months after paying fines. Their cargo is confiscated, but their ship and licenses remain valid. West set down her datapad very carefully, and then they'll go back to doing this. Maybe more carefully next time, maybe to more victims. Maybe for decades before anyone catches them again. That's not our jurisdiction to determine, Jix said. We enforce existing law. We don't create new law. Then I guess we'll have to work around your law, West said. She activated her own comm. This is Captain West to all human diplomatic vessels in this sector. I'm transmitting evidence of an ongoing slavery operation. The perpetrators are about to be released under current council protocols. I need volunteers for a long-term monitoring mission. Who's with me? The responses came immediately. 7 human ships, confirmed. They were diverting to the station's coordinates. West looked at Jix with calm determination. We're going to follow Voss and his crew. Every ship they contact, every station they dock at, every transaction they make. We're going to document everything and share it with every species that cares about protecting their people. And when they inevitably return to this business, we'll be there. You can't do that, Jix protested. That's harassment. That violates their rights to conduct trade. Sue us, West said. Arrest us. File complaints. We'll cooperate with every legal challenge. But we're not stopping. They took children, Officer Jix. Children. And your law says they get to walk away in 3 months. So we'll be their shadows until they retire, die, or stop. Tim felt his throat tighten. This wasn't revenge. It was something more fundamental. Humans had looked at the system, found it inadequate, and simply decided to work around it. Jix turned to Tim. You caused this. You contacted them. I did, Tim confirmed. And I'd do it again. Over the next 2 weeks, human ships dismantled Voss's entire operation. Not through violence or illegal action. Through persistence. They traced his contacts, identified his network, and shared everything with local authorities who actually cared. Species that didn't know they had citizens missing suddenly had evidence. Stations that looked the other way suddenly had humans asking very public questions. The council received 47 complaints about human interference in internal affairs. They also received thank you messages from families who got their loved ones back because humans wouldn't stop looking. Captain West sent him a message before departing. Thank you for trusting us. Sometimes mercy means not letting cruelty hide behind law. Jix filed a report recommending humans be removed from patrol integration programs. They were too disruptive, too unwilling to accept established systems, too prone to independent action when they disagreed with authority. The report was accurate, but it also missed the point entirely. Humans weren't disrupting the system because they didn't understand it. They were disrupting it because they understood it perfectly and found it unacceptable. Tim looked at the empty docking clamp where the Dreth freighter had been. Voss was in custody, his network collapsed, his victims free. The council would debate for months about jurisdiction and precedent. But those 23 beings were home. Sometimes mercy wasn't about following the rules. It was about refusing to let rules be an excuse for cruelty. And if the council couldn't understand that, humans would teach them through every stubborn, persistent, infuriating act of compassion they could manage. The council chamber had never been this divided. Dr. Haven watched from the gallery as representatives argued, pleaded, and threatened over humanity's membership application. 3 months of debate, countless reports, and the vote remained deadlocked. The chamber's ancient walls had witnessed 1,000 difficult decisions, but none quite like this. Ambassador Ruth Davies sat in the applicant's chair, hands folded calmly in her lap. She'd answer questions for hours without complaint, explained human behavior without defensiveness, and listened to accusations without anger. Haven admired her patience. He wasn't sure he'd have the same composure if his entire species' future depended on bureaucrats who feared exactly what made his species valuable. Morith called for order as the debate threatened to spiral into chaos. We will proceed to final statements before the vote. Those opposing humanity's membership, present your position. Defense Minister Tallis stood, her crystalline form refracting the chamber lights. We cannot admit a species we cannot predict. Humans have demonstrated a willingness to override council authority when their moral judgment conflicts with our laws. Officer Bradley's actions, while individually commendable, set a dangerous precedent. What happens when humans decide our trade policies are cruel? Our criminal justice system? Our resource allocation? We'll face constant interference from a species that believes their genetic programming for mercy overrides our sovereignty. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the chamber. Haven couldn't argue with the logic. Humans were dangerous to established order. The evidence was overwhelming. Admiral Finn added his concerns. Military assessment confirms humans are unpredictable in conflict. They fight harder for abstract concepts of justice than for territorial gain. This makes them impossible to deter or negotiate with using conventional methods. As allies, we cannot rely on them to follow strategic doctrine. As adversaries, we cannot predict what will trigger their unified response. The logical choice is to maintain them as an external species under observation protocols. The opposing votes were tallying in Haven's mental count. Humanity was going to lose. They'd be rejected not for being too aggressive or too weak, but for being too compassionate in ways the council found threatening. Then General Kren stood. Haven's antennae perked up. Kren had written the threat assessment that should have doomed humanity's application. I wrote the report everyone keeps referencing. Kren began, his gravelly voice filling the chamber. I concluded humans are dangerous and unpredictable. I stand by that assessment. But I also recommended we admit them, and I want to explain why before we vote. He activated a display showing human history. We're not voting on whether humans are dangerous. They are. We're voting on what kind of dangerous species we want in the galaxy. Currently, our council includes species that are dangerous through aggression, through technological superiority, through resource control. We manage these dangers through deterrence, treaties, and mutual benefit. It works because danger motivated by self-interest is predictable. Kren changed the display to show recent human actions. Humans are dangerous through compassion. That's unprecedented, and it terrifies us. But consider what we're actually afraid of. We fear they'll interfere with our systems. We fear they'll judge our choices. We fear they'll refuse to cooperate if they deem us cruel. Those fears are valid, but they're only threats if we're doing things we know are wrong. The chamber grew quiet. Kren's words carried weight that diplomatic speeches couldn't match. I spent my career studying warfare and violence. I know cruelty when I see it. Our council isn't evil, but we tolerate practices we shouldn't. Voss's slavery operation existed because our laws made it easier to look away than to act. The Dreth trafficking network operated for decades, because stopping it was inconvenient. We tell ourselves we're respecting cultural differences, but sometimes we're just choosing comfort over conscience. He turned to face Ruth directly. Humans won't let us make that choice anymore. If we admit them, they'll be the voice in every council session asking uncomfortable questions. They'll be the species that refuses to accept that's how it's always been as justification for cruelty. They'll push us to be better, even when we don't want to be pushed. That's terrifying. It's also exactly what we need. Ambassador Ruth stood, and Morith gestured for her to speak. Council members, I understand your concerns. You're right to be cautious. Humans will challenge your systems. We'll ask difficult questions. When we see suffering we can prevent, we'll act, even if it's inconvenient for diplomacy. That's not a threat. It's a promise. But it's also not a demand that you change to suit us. She walked to the center of the chamber, her voice steady and clear. General Kryn asked what kind of galaxy you want. Let me ask a simpler question. What kind of galaxy do your children deserve? Your people, your vulnerable, your future generations? Do they deserve a galaxy where the dangerous species are the ones without mercy? Where power is the only thing that matters? Where cruelty is tolerated as long as it's legal? Or do they deserve a galaxy where at least one species will stand up and say no, this is wrong, when everyone else stays silent? Ruth looked around the chamber, meeting eyes with representatives who'd argued for and against humanity. You scanned our DNA looking for mercy, and what you found terrified you. Not because we're weak, but because we're strong in ways you don't know how to control. You can't bribe mercy. You can't threaten it. You can't negotiate it away. All you can do is choose whether you want that kind of strength working with you or watching you from outside. She returned to her seat. We're not asking to lead the council. We're not demanding you change your laws overnight. We're asking for membership so we can be part of the conversation when those changes need to happen. Because they do need to happen, and you know it, and having us inside asking questions is less disruptive than having us outside forcing answers. The vote was called. Having watched the display as each representative registered their decision, the count stayed close, swinging back and forth as smaller members weighed their choices. Finally, the last vote registered. Humanity was admitted by a margin of 3 votes. Provisional membership, restricted authority, extensive monitoring protocols. It was the most reluctant acceptance in council history. Morith stood to deliver the official verdict. Humanity is granted council membership, effective immediately. Ambassador Davies, your people are now part of the Galactic Council. He paused, his crest lifting in what might have been respect or resignation. May we all learn to live with the consequences. Ruth thanked the council with grace, but having noticed she didn't smile. She understood what this meant. Humanity had won the right to participate in galactic civilization, but they'd done it by making everyone afraid of what they'd do if excluded. That wasn't a victory. It was a responsibility. Later, as the chamber emptied, Haven found Ruth on the observation deck. She stood looking at Earth through the viewport, a small blue marble in the vast darkness. You know they'll be watching everything you do, Haven said quietly, waiting for you to prove them right about the danger you pose. I know, Ruth replied, but they'll also be watching when we help someone they would have ignored. When we stand up against cruelty they would have tolerated. When we ask questions they would have left unspoken. Maybe fear got us through the door, but eventually they'll see what mercy really means. Haven's antennae drooped with something like sadness. What if they never stop being afraid? Ruth finally smiled, but it was tired. Then we'll just have to be the kind of dangerous they can live with. The kind that only scares people who profit from cruelty. The kind that makes children sleep safer and the vulnerable feel protected. We can be that kind of dangerous. We've been doing it for thousands of years. She turned from the viewport. They scanned our DNA for mercy and found something that terrified them. Good. Some things should be terrifying. Indifference to suffering should terrify us. Acceptance of cruelty should terrify us. The real danger isn't that we have mercy wired into our genes. It's that anyone would see that as a weakness. As Ruth walked away to begin humanity's first official day as council members, Haven remained at the viewport. The galaxy had just changed in ways no one could predict. A species driven by genetic compassion now had a voice in galactic affairs. They would be difficult, disruptive, and demanding. They would also, haven't suspected, make the galaxy better despite itself. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is care too much to look away from suffering. And humans had just proven they'd never look away, no matter what it cost them. The galaxy would learn to live with human mercy, one uncomfortable question at a time.